Waiting patiently, and we're really grateful, Margaret, that you've been able to extend your schedule this morning. Our final speaker in this first session, Margaret Burgess, MSP, MSP for Cunningham South, which is Ayrshire, yes, South Ayrshire, and the Minister for Housing and Welfare to respond to what she's heard this morning and share her own views. Please welcome Margaret Burgess. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Jim, and I'm pleased to be here again this morning. I was at the conference last year, and I feel I'm ready to put my hand up when Jim was saying how many of you attended, when did you last come. I certainly was here last year as well. And I will respond to some of the points made by Louise and Martin during my remarks. I always think it is important to hear from people who have experienced poverty, to let us really, it is really quite emotive to hear that, and I think it's important that we do hear that, and I think the government has to hear that as well. We have to know what it's like for people if we want to make the changes that we all want to see. And I've always got mixed feelings about attending an event such as this, because I really get no comfort about talking about poverty, particularly in a country as wealthy as Scotland, where we live, and to talk about poverty and to hear the stories that we heard this morning. But it does give us an opportunity to talk about what we can do to tackle poverty and to work together to improve things for everyone in Scotland. And the Scottish Government is absolutely determined to address the causes of poverty and to help people overcome the barriers that stop them achieving their potential. Our refreshed child poverty strategy outlines our approach over the next 3 years, and it is based on prevention and intervention, and I think that's important, and I think from the comments that Martin made earlier, that's really what we need to do. We need to intervene early, we need to prevent poverty starting in the first place. And our strategy focuses on 3 key areas: pockets, which is about maximising household resources; prospects, which is about improving the chances of children and their life chances; and places, and that's about ensuring that all of us can live in a sustainable home and community. And I think we've heard from both speakers this morning just how important housing is to getting out of poverty, and I'll touch on that a bit later on. But our strategy aims to make a real difference to the lives of people living in Scotland. And the Scottish Government is taking action now to reduce the levels of poverty. And our aim, which should be the aim of any government, is to have Scotland free of poverty, which is the title of your session today. And the actions that we're taking include providing £2.5 million tackling poverty funding to key organisations to help maximise household resources and engage with local communities and anti-poverty initiatives. And I think that's very important that this is done on a local basis as well, because I think in local communities the answer lies very often in the community if they have the right resources to take the decisions which matter in their community. And I think it's also any outcome is more sustainable if it's based with what is agreed and been determined by local community activists. We're also spending around £250 million over 3 years on fuel poverty and energy efficiency programmes to help tackle fuel poverty. We're committing over £125 million across government to support around 23,000 people towards work and access into work. We're defending and extending certain core universal services, rights and benefits through the social wage, and that's things like free prescriptions, the council tax freeze, the educational maintenance allowance, and free school meals that we've recently introduced. All of those things are to help people with the cost of living that we heard from Louise and how difficult it is struggling as a lone parent. And in addition, last week the Scottish Legal Aid Board announced a £2.5 million provided by the Scottish Government and the Money Advice Service to help families with children facing debt and money problems. And the new programme will support the implementation of the child poverty strategy. But at this point, I would want to say something that you've possibly just heard me speak before, probably heard me saying this before. When we talk about money advice and budgeting for people in poverty, I want to make it very clear that I think the best budgeters that I've ever come across are people on a low income. They really struggle and they can budget, which, I mean, I used to wish when I worked in the money advice sector I could take a lesson from some people. And the one thing that and it's absolutely right to say that people don't have enough money. If you don't have enough money, the choices become much more difficult. But when I was in money advice and we used to sort of go through budget with someone and say to somebody, but what about food? You need to, how much do you spend in food? And invariably the answer was just what's left, or I go to my mum's one day of the week or another day of the week. And that's not about a family or a person who can't budget. That's about somebody who just doesn't have enough money to get by, to pay the gas, the electricity, the telephone, all the other things that go with running a house, and the shoes that Louise mentioned, all of those things, the clothing, and the things that children want. And why shouldn't they have them? Why should a child in a poorer home not have access to the same things that other children would take for granted? And that's something I'm very conscious of, and something that I'm aware of in any strategy that we put together as a Scottish Government. So although we talk about money advice and budgeting, it's not about saying people in low incomes can't budget. It's not about that at all. It's about helping prepare people for when they do get into the opportunity of work, maybe managing their finances in a different way, getting their money at a different time of the week, using direct debits and banking systems that they perhaps haven't used before, and ensuring they get the best deal in their fuel supplier. So that's what we're talking about in budgeting, and I want to make it clear it's not about saying people in a low income can't manage their money, because I can tell you they can manage their money, they just don't have enough to manage. The Scottish Government is also supporting, leading on from what I said there, the Scottish Living Wage campaign, and already pays a living wage to all staff covered by the Scottish Government's public pay sector. And we've provided funding of over £80,000 to the Poverty Alliance to promote living wage accreditation and increase the number of employers paying the living wage in Scotland. And last week, the Deputy First Minister announced proposed amendments to the Stage 3 procurement reform bill to make it explicit that the guidance about bidder selection will address remuneration and payment of the living wage. The guidance will require public bodies to include in their procurement strategy a statement of their general policy on payment of a living wage to persons involved in delivering public sector contracts. There should be no doubt whatsoever about the Scottish Government's commitment to the living wage. But welcome though these announcements are, it's absolutely unacceptable, as I said earlier, that anyone in a prosperous country as prosperous as Scotland should be living in poverty. And the Scottish Government is using its limited powers to do the utmost to do what we can to reduce the number of people living in poverty in Scotland, and we continue to raise awareness of the scourge of poverty with our UK counterparts. And we continue to challenge the UK governments about the damaging impact that welfare cuts coming from Westminster. But a lot has changed since we first published the Child Poverty Strategy in Scotland in 2011. And the latest published figures show that relative child poverty in Scotland is 15%, which is a fall of 21% from when this government first came to power in 2007. So we should be pleased that progress is being made, but we should remain concerned that these numbers are far, far too high and are set to rise higher as a result of the decisions being taken at Westminster. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies has estimated that the child poverty rate in Scotland will increase by an additional 50,000 children in Scotland in poverty, and if you take into account housing costs, it could be 100,000 more children in poverty in Scotland, purely because of the UK government welfare reforms. And I just found it last week, I don't know how many of you watched or listened to Alistair Carmichael, the Secretary of State, the UK Government Secretary of State for Scotland, when they launched their welfare and benefits paper here in Scotland last week. And he described that system as fantastic. Now, I can't understand it. I mean, it's out with anything that I can get my head round, how anyone, politician or otherwise, can suggest that a system which is designed and is going to put up to 100,000 more children in Scotland into poverty is fantastic. I actually think it's disgraceful, and it's shocking that any politician could describe that as something good, because it's simply not good, and it's not good enough anywhere, and it's certainly not good enough for Scotland. The Scottish Government is spending significant amount of money on mitigating the UK welfare reforms, and we shouldn't have to do this. Our current and planned spending will be at least £260 million for mitigation of welfare reform over the period 13-14 to 15-16. And this includes investing an additional £9.2 million into the new Scottish Welfare Fund, giving it a total of £33 million. And it's still early days for the Scottish Welfare Fund, and there's more to learn as we go forward with local authorities and other partners to get the fund on a permanent statutory footing. But the fund has the potential to do more than just meet short-term needs. It's the potential to help address the underlying issues and often complex needs of those living in poverty, and referring them and joining up with other sources of help such as welfare rights, advocacy and housing. And the most recent statistics in the Scottish Welfare Fund, published on the 15th of April, show that the changes we made to the guidance to the Welfare Fund in October are working, and that awareness of the help available is growing. And crucially, the funding is reaching those in the most deprived areas of Scotland, with around 50% being awarded to applicants living in the 20% most deprived areas of Scotland. We also recently announced, John Swinney announced, further help for those being affected by the bedroom tax. And I think that's important. We shouldn't have to do that, but I think it's right that that was made, that John Swinney announced sufficient funding to fully mitigate the bedroom tax in Scotland. And again, I think it's disgraceful that the UK Government has not responded to several letters from the Deputy First Minister and from John Swinney to the UK Government, asking them to lift the cap on the bedroom tax in Scotland. What that would do would allow the Scottish Government to fully mitigate the bedroom tax as has been asked for. But it would also we're not asking the UK Government for any money in this. It allows the UK Government to carry on with their savings that they are determined to make, but it allows us to take a different solution here in Scotland. And we're still waiting on a response from the UK Government. And again, I think that's quite disgraceful that we haven't had that response, because we believe absolutely the best way of mitigating the bedroom tax under the current reserve powers is through discretionary housing payments. Any other method means people getting into rent arrears and then hoping to get them or getting them written off at the end. And I certainly know that people don't want to get into rent arrears, even if they thought or knew that they could get these arrears written off. We should not be asking people to build up arrears. It's not the right thing to do. The discretionary housing payment's the way to do it. It simply means that people are entitled at the start. It's part of what they're entitled to. They put their application in, and the payment is awarded for a 12-month period. And I think that is the right way forward, and it's the only thing that's stopping that happening at the moment. And the way we want it to happen is the UK Government. Another thing that is concerning me about welfare reforms is the benefit sanctions, and I think Louise spoke about the fear of benefit sanctions, and we've already heard from the Trussell Trust and emergency food aid organisations that they have an increase of 400% of people accessing food aid, emergency food aid, and of that the majority of the reasons given are for problems with the benefit system or benefit sanctions. And to help that, the Deputy First Minister announced the Scottish Government Emergency Food Aid Action Plan to be supported by £1 million over the next 2 years. And it includes £500,000 to Fair Share to support their work in taking surplus food from the food industry and making it available to charities and other organisations. We're setting up an emergency food aid grant fund to respond to immediate demands for emergency food aid and to help address the underlying causes of food poverty by the other £500,000 over 2 years. And as a matter of urgency, we're working with organisations in the food aid sector and the voluntary sector to develop criteria for this new fund. But do I think the role of government should be to fund food aid in our own country? No, I don't. I don't think we should have to do this. But this Scottish Government is not prepared to stand back and watch people suffer because of a broken welfare state. And I don't say the words broken welfare state lightly. I think the UK welfare state is broken. I don't want to see a state where we're depending on Scottish Welfare Fund and emergency food aid to take over and replace the welfare state. A welfare state is something that any civilised society should be proud of having. It should be there. We pay into it when we can, and we get back when we need. And everybody at some point in their life will get something from the welfare state, whether it be child benefit, where we're bringing up a family, working tax credit as we're moving onwards, or in fact retirement pension when we retire. So all of us should have a stake in a welfare state, and I certainly want to see one that works and works well for the people of Scotland, and that there is no stigma attached to it. We all have part of the welfare state, and nobody should be ashamed of saying they're in receipt of any benefit, and we have to get that stigma removed. But we can see in Scotland just now with the UK cuts, if they continue, that we could result in the welfare bill in Scotland by being reduced by about £6 billion, and it is just not possible for the Scottish Government to fully mitigate that under our current reserve powers. We have to divert money already away from other services to deal with the consequences of welfare reform, but we cannot divert £6 billion away. And I mentioned earlier about Alistair Carmichael coming up here last week and telling us when he was working in a sort of, in my view, in a sort of parallel line to what's really happening here, when he said about Scotland can't afford welfare spending without the UK. And I actually think the reverse is quite the case, because we have seen the welfare state being dismantled. Spending in social protection in Scotland, which is benefits and pensions, is actually more affordable, and we spend less than we do in the rest of the UK. Scotland is a wealthy country, certainly wealthy enough to be independent. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But the real issue is why so many of us in Scotland don't get the benefit of that wealth. And I do believe it's because of decades of Westminster government decisions of whatever political persuasion in Westminster. I don't think the Westminster system can work anymore for Scotland. The gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider. And I believe that independence would give us the opportunity to address these issues for ourselves. In an independent Scotland, we'd create a system that works for the people of Scotland based on principles of early intervention and responding to individual needs. In Scotland's future, our white paper on independence, the Scottish Government sets out its vision and priorities for action as the first government of an independent Scotland. And these include actions in taxation, welfare and benefits, and a transformational extension of childcare, all of which would have a significant impact on poverty. And for people in work and low incomes, we would ensure that the minimum wage would increase by at least the rate of inflation. We'd also increase benefits by the rate of inflation to help keep pace with the rising cost of living. And to summarise, through our new child poverty strategy, the Scottish Government is taking action and will continue to take action to reduce poverty in Scotland. And we will, regardless of the outcome of the referendum, we will never turn our back on those affected by poverty in our communities. But I've also set out plans to show what I think we could do, how better we could be with independence, where I believe we could have a far greater impact in tackling poverty in Scotland. So I leave that thought for a Scotland free of poverty, but I will thank the previous speakers, because it certainly is always useful for a government minister to hear from people who've experienced poverty, and I have taken on board, I didn't cover housing there, but I absolutely am aware of the housing hazard, both in someone who's perhaps coming out of institutional or prison, and also for people feeling trapped in an area, a house that they can't move to. And housing is a priority for the Scottish Government. We are absolutely committed to social housing. We have a target of 4,000 social houses each year of this Government, and we're well on track to meet that target. We also have introduced a strategy for the private rented sector to tackle some of the issues that have been raised about the private rented sector. So we are doing what we can within the powers that we have, and we will continue to listen, and no matter the outcome of September, we will continue to be in the side and help improve the lot of people in poverty in Scotland. Thank you.